The betrayal came quietly, like a draft seeping through a locked window, unannounced and chilling. Daniel Rivers had given 16 years of his life to Crestfall Industries. He had entered the company as a fresh graduate, full of restless ambition and loyalty, working late nights without complaint, sacrificing weekends, even shelving his personal life for the sake of climbing. By the time he turned 40, he had carved his place into the fabric of the corporation, rising to vice president of operations, a man whose reputation was built on precision, foresight, and results. But success in the corporate world was rarely a guarantee of security. It began with whispers in conference rooms, sudden exclusions from meetings he had always attended, emails left unanswered, and projects quietly reassigned. His gut told him something was shifting, though he couldn't yet name it. Then came the board meeting that stripped him bare. A glossy presentation, crafted by his own subordinate, unveiled a visionary restructuring plan that carried every mark of Daniel's strategic work, but his name was nowhere on it. The credit had been redirected, neatly maliciously, to none other than Ethan Cross, the CEO's golden protege and Daniel's so-called friend. The betrayal cut deeper than professional slight. It was personal. Ethan had once come to Daniel for guidance, leaning on him like a mentor. Daniel had been the one to recommend Ethan's promotion. Yet now Ethan stood before the board, basking in the glow of Daniel's stolen brilliance, painting him as outdated, a relic clinging to methods the company no longer needed. The board's vote came down swiftly. Daniel was out. No thanks, no recognition, just an escort from security and a severance package meant to silence him. For weeks afterward, Daniel sat in the silence of his apartment, watching the world carry on without him. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, not the kind that lashes out blindly, but the sort that calcifies into something deliberate, dangerous, and patient. He replayed the humiliation in his mind, every smug glance from Ethan, every hollow word from executives who had once praised him. If they thought they had discarded him, they were wrong. He would not be erased so easily. Daniel began piecing together his plan with the same methodical discipline that had once made him invaluable to Crestfall. He reached out quietly to old contacts, engineers, analysts, managers, people who had been slighted, underpaid, or discarded by the company in its relentless pursuit of profit. They responded with bitterness, with stories of their own betrayals, and slowly a coalition formed, bound not by loyalty to Daniel, but by a shared hunger for reckoning. He studied Crestfall's vulnerabilities. He knew its supply chains, its vendor relationships, its regulatory loopholes. He understood which divisions were stretched thin, which contracts had been secured with falsified data, which departments were masking inefficiencies beneath polished reports. Piece by piece, he mapped out the arteries of the company, marking where to cut, where to bleed them slowly. The first strike came quietly. A key vendor, long disgruntled over late payments, abruptly severed ties with Crestfall, throwing its manufacturing schedule into chaos. Rumors began to circulate about faulty compliance documents submitted to international regulators. A whistleblower complaint surfaced, pointing directly at divisions Ethan himself had overseen. The stock price, once buoyant, began to quiver under the weight of suspicion. Daniel never showed his face. He was a ghost moving through the system, feeding journalists carefully curated leaks, nudging regulators in the right direction, pulling old employees into strategic roles in rival firms. Each move was surgical, leaving Ethan scrambling publicly to maintain control while privately drowning in fires he could not extinguish. But Daniel was not content with merely watching Crestfall stumble. His revenge was not about momentary discomfort. It was about annihilation. He wanted Ethan to know, with absolute clarity, that the empire he had stolen would collapse at his feet. When Crestfall announced a new flagship partnership, Daniel already had evidence of concealed liabilities ready to surface. The news broke within hours of the announcement, sending shockwaves through the industry. Shareholders revolted, lawsuits piled high, and the once proud corporation began hemorrhaging talent as employees fled to competitors. Ethan tried to hold on, calling emergency press conferences, spinning narratives of sabotage and misinformation. But the board, once dazzled by him, turned cold. His charm could not salvage billions lost overnight. Within a year, Crestfall Industries, a titan Daniel had helped build, was crumbling in plain sight, its reputation shredded, its future uncertain. It was only then that Daniel allowed his presence to be known. An exposé surfaced in a major financial journal, written with surgical detail, tracing the arc of Crestfall's downfall back to the moment of betrayal. At the heart of the article was the story of Daniel Rivers, the loyal executive betrayed and discarded, who had risen from humiliation not with bitterness, but with ruthless clarity. His name became synonymous with corporate vengeance, a whispered warning in boardrooms across the country. Loyalty, once broken, can turn into the sharpest blade. As he watched Ethan give his final resignation speech, hollow-eyed and defeated, Daniel felt no triumph, no joy. Revenge was not sweet, it was necessary. In the ashes of Crestfall, he found not happiness, but vindication. And in the corporate world, sometimes that was the only justice left. Daniel Rivers' descent into vengeance did not come in one sweeping decision, but in a slow, deliberate awakening. At first, he thought he might simply move on, find another company, perhaps even start his own. But every time he drafted a resume or took a call from a recruiter, the same image would flash before him: Ethan standing at the head of that boardroom, grinning faintly as Daniel was stripped of everything. The betrayal was not just the theft of his work, it was the theft of his dignity, his years, his identity. That sort of theft, Daniel realized, could not be forgiven. The world of corporations was not built on morality. It was built on leverage, information, and timing. Daniel had once used those tools to create value, to keep Crestfall efficient and profitable. Now he would turn them toward destruction. The irony was not lost on him. The same skills that made him indispensable would now make him the company's executioner. He started small, building shadows instead of drawing attention. He spent weeks combing through old archives, confidential documents he had saved out of habit, files no one else remembered, contracts from 5, 10 years ago. Buried within them were clauses Crestfall had violated quietly, shortcuts Ethan had encouraged, when profits mattered more than compliance. Daniel knew regulators were always looking for ammunition. All they needed was direction. Anonymously, he provided it. The first crack in Crestfall's armor came when European regulators launched a surprise audit into one of their overseas plants. The news barely made headlines at first, but Daniel smiled when he saw Ethan's name linked to the questionable paperwork. He knew what was coming. It was never the first blow that toppled a giant, but the accumulation of many. Meanwhile, Daniel began to weave together a network of allies. Not friends, he trusted no one anymore, but co-conspirators who stood to gain from Crestfall's decline. A logistics director he once mentored, now working at a rival firm. A compliance officer forced out for refusing to sign off on Ethan's fraudulent numbers. A journalist hungry for stories that could make her career. They did not need loyalty to Daniel, they needed only opportunity, and he offered it to them in abundance. He never met them all at once, never let any single person see the full picture. Compartmentalization kept him safe. To some, he was simply a source of information. To others, a ghostly strategist offering whispers of where to strike. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed, though only Daniel held the final image in his mind. Crestfall's public image began to fracture. First came delays in shipments. Then rumors of faulty components in key products. Disgruntled employees leaked internal memos showing cost-cutting measures that endangered safety. Each incident alone seemed minor, recoverable. Together, they painted a portrait of incompetence and greed. Investors grew restless. Journalists circled like vultures. Ethan, once hailed as the visionary leader of Crestfall, began appearing tense in interviews. His smile, once effortless, now seemed forced. His answers sounded rehearsed, brittle. Behind closed doors, executives whispered of missed targets, of projects delayed indefinitely. Daniel knew because he still had ears in the building, secretaries, assistants, junior staff who had always admired him. Some reached out to him in confidence. Others became conduits of information without even realizing it. Then Daniel escalated. He unearthed proof that Crestfall had falsified emissions data for its manufacturing plants, a scandal with the power to not only cripple its reputation but invite legal ruin. He leaked it through a third-party channel, ensuring it would look like a discovery by an independent watchdog. When the story broke, governments launched investigations, environmental groups staged protests, and Crestfall's stock plummeted overnight. Ethan fought desperately, blaming legacy practices predating his leadership, but Daniel had prepared for this. More leaks surfaced, emails with Ethan's direct approval, reports with his signature. The walls closed in. What made Daniel's revenge truly ruthless was not the scale of destruction, but the precision of his strikes. He never acted recklessly, never sought a quick win. He wanted Ethan to feel the collapse inch by inch, to watch the empire he had stolen crumble around him while knowing he was powerless to stop it. As the months stretched into years, Crestfall became a shell of its former self. Rivals absorbed its clients. Lawsuits drained its finances. Employees fled in waves. The board, once Ethan's shield, abandoned him. His resignation came quietly, without the grandeur he once basked in, a bitter end for the man who had thought himself untouchable. Daniel read the resignation statement alone in his apartment. No smile crossed his face. He felt neither joy nor sorrow. Revenge, he realized, was not about catharsis. It was about balance. Ethan had taken his dignity. Daniel had taken everything Ethan valued. It was not happiness, but it was justice. In the years that followed, the story of Crestfall's collapse was told in business schools and boardrooms. Some spoke of it as a cautionary tale of corporate greed, others as a lesson in the dangers of betrayal. Daniel's name was rarely spoken aloud, but those who knew whispered it with respect and fear. He had become a myth, a reminder that in the ruthless world of business, betrayal could awaken a predator more dangerous than any rival. And Daniel, though he never returned to corporate life, lived with quiet satisfaction. For he knew one truth above all others: vindication was not given. It was taken, ruthlessly, by those who had the will to claim it. Daniel could almost track the stages of Ethan's downfall as if he had designed them from the start: denial, anger, scrambling, and finally despair. But in truth, he had needed to create every fire, only to strike matches in places he already knew were soaked in gasoline. Crestfall's success had always been built on shaky ground, its foundations compromised by greed and shortcuts. Ethan had been arrogant enough to believe those cracks would never show. Daniel simply made sure the world noticed. Still, revenge was never without risk. Daniel knew he was playing a dangerous game. Each move required calculation, each leak carefully disguised to ensure no trace returned to him. He used burner phones, encrypted servers, fake identities that he abandoned after single use. His apartment became a war room, walls covered with charts and timelines, files stacked in meticulous order, each red pin marking another wound delivered. To anyone else, it might have looked obsessive, even deranged. To Daniel, it was strategy. There were nights when exhaustion nearly overtook him, when he wondered if he had become the very monster he despised. But then he would remember the look on Ethan's face that day in the boardroom, the smug triumph, the casual dismissal of 16 years of loyalty, and the doubt hardened back into resolve. Ethan had taken his life's work and erased him. This was justice, no matter how ruthless it appeared. As months bled into years, Daniel began to see the more subtle effects of his campaign. Ethan, once celebrated as a rising star in the corporate world, became radioactive. His phone calls went unanswered. His allies distanced themselves. Invitations to exclusive panels and conferences vanished. Even his personal life suffered. Divorce rumors leaked to the tabloids, stories of him lashing out in public. Daniel hadn't orchestrated those, but he recognized them as the inevitable rot of a man under pressure. Revenge, once set in motion, had a way of multiplying. But Daniel was not content with watching Ethan lose status. He wanted Crestfall itself to suffer, to crumble so completely that no one could resurrect it. He targeted their crown jewel, an ambitious merger meant to secure Crestfall's dominance for the next decade. The deal was fragile. built on inflated numbers and hidden debts. Daniel knew because he had written the original feasibility reports years ago, the ones Ethan had later revised. All it took was one leak, one whisper to the right bank about discrepancies in Crestfall's books. The merger collapsed before it was signed, and with it, any hope of Crestfall recovering. When news of the failed deal broke, Daniel watched the live coverage on television. Ethan stood before reporters, his face pale and drawn, stammering about temporary setbacks and strategic redirection. Gone was the polished charisma. What stood before the cameras was a man stripped bare, scrambling to convince the world of a future that no longer existed. Daniel studied the footage the way a hunter studies his prey, not with glee, but with cold, quiet satisfaction. By the time the board forced Ethan out, Crestfall's reputation was in ruins. Competitors carved up its market share. Investigations drained its coffers. Shareholders filed lawsuits. The company that had once towered as an untouchable giant became a cautionary tale, its name synonymous with failure. And Daniel? He disappeared from the public eye. He didn't seek recognition, didn't boast of his triumph. He slipped into a quieter life, consulting occasionally under assumed names, investing in small ventures that gave him freedom without attention. He lived simply, but always with a sense of control. He had faced the abyss of betrayal and emerged sharper, colder, untouchable. Sometimes, when he passed a business magazine in a store or overheard executives talking at a cafe, he'd catch his own story told in whispers. They never knew it was him. They spoke of the man who brought down Crestfall, a faceless phantom who had shown what one person's vengeance could accomplish. Some called him ruthless, others a hero, but all agreed on one thing. Betrayal was a risk no corporation could afford to ignore, because you never knew when the person you discarded would come back with sharper teeth than you could imagine. On sleepless nights, Daniel would sit by the window, city lights flickering below, and think about what he had done. He did not regret it. Regret was for those who doubted their path. He felt something colder, heavier, an awareness that revenge had cost him as much as it had cost Crestfall. He had burned years of his life in pursuit of destruction. But unlike Ethan, he had not lost everything. He still had his mind, his discipline, his dignity. That was enough. In the end, Ethan Cross's name faded into obscurity, a footnote in corporate history. Crestfall's buildings were sold off, its logo vanished from skylines. But Daniel Rivers remained, a ghost in the machine, a reminder etched into the DNA of every boardroom. Betray the wrong man, and you may create the instrument of your own ruin. And though he rarely smiled, though the taste of victory was bitter on his tongue, Daniel knew one truth with unshakable certainty. He had been betrayed, but he had also been vindicated. And in the ruthless world he had once served, vindication was worth more than forgiveness, more than peace, more than anything.